The hinge on the clinic's heavy glass door groaned with a complaint that echoed my own. I pushed through, my cane tapping a slow, percussive beat on the polished linoleum floor. Tap, step, drag. Tap, step, drag. It was the anthem of my 77 years, a rhythm my body had composed without my consent. My mind, however, still hummed along to a different tune, a sharp, clear melody of theorems and proofs, of elegant solutions waiting to be found in the chaos of variables. The body was failing, but the engine inside, the one that had powered 3 decades of teaching algebra and calculus to disinterested teenagers, that engine was purring just fine. The air in the waiting room was a sterile cocktail of antiseptic and forced patience. It was a new clinic, all chrome and abstract art, a place that felt more like a tech startup than a house of healing. My old doctor, Dr. Evans, a man who remembered my wife Martha and always asked about my rose bushes, had finally hung up his stethoscope. His retirement felt like the closing of a final familiar door. This new place, this comprehensive wellness center, was the uncharted territory I'd been forced to navigate. I gave my name at the reception. Arthur Thompson, for a checkup with Dr. Miller. The young woman behind the desk smiled, a bright automated flash. He's running a little behind. The screen will update. She gestured to a large, silent monitor on the wall.
I found a chair with minimal groaning and settled in, my hands resting on the polished wood of my cane. I'd carved it myself from a piece of black walnut after Martha passed. It gave me something to do with my hands, something to focus on besides the silence she left behind. I watched the other patients, a young mother shushing a fretful child, a businessman tapping furiously on his phone. And then there were the others, my people, the silver-haired cohort. We exchanged brief, knowing glances. We were the ones who understood the language of creaking joints and the importance of a good, solid cane. 40 minutes past my appointment time. A nurse in garishly patterned scrubs called my name. Arthur Thompson, room 3. The walk down the corridor was a study in measured movement. Each step was a calculated decision, a negotiation with the protest in my knees and the dull, constant ache in my lower back. The nurse led me into a small, cold room and instructed me to sit on the examination table, the crinkly paper rustling in loud protest beneath me. She took my vitals with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. "The doctor will be with you shortly," she said, and vanished, leaving me alone with the poster of the human circulatory system and the slow, deliberate tick of the clock on the wall. Another 20 minutes bled away. I occupied my mind by calculating the area of the ceiling tiles, then estimating the volume of the room. It was an old habit, a mental exercise to keep the gears oiled. Finally, the door swung open with a gust of impatient energy. "Arthur Thompson? I'm Dr. Miller."
He was young. So very young. He couldn't have been more than 30, with the kind of unlined, confident face that had never truly been weathered by disappointment. His white coat was stark and new, his shoes impossibly shiny. He held a tablet, his thumbs scrolling rapidly, his eyes barely leaving the screen as he entered. "It's Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice calm. A small correction, a boundary. I'd spent a lifetime being Mr. Thompson. It was a title earned. He glanced up,
a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Right. So, what brings you in today?" He didn't look at me. He looked at the tablet. I began to describe the new, specific pain in my shoulder, a sharp twinge that woke me at night. I'd only gotten 2 sentences out. "At your age," he interrupted, not unkindly, but with a dismissive finality that was far worse. "That's to be expected. General wear and tear. The human body isn't designed to last a century." He moved to the sink, washing his hands with a theatrical vigor. I felt the words die in my throat. At your age, the great dismissal, the universal qualifier that rendered all subsequent data irrelevant. He proceeded with the examination, his touch clinical and hurried. He listened to my heart, his gaze distant, as if hearing a familiar, boring song. He tapped my knees with a rubber hammer, the reactions noted with a grunt. When I tried to elaborate on the shoulder pain, to give him the specific data he, as a scientist, should crave, he sighed. "Mr. Thompson, we see this all the time. It's important to differentiate between actual pathology and the normal anxieties that can accompany getting older."
He said anxieties like it was a synonym for inconvenience. There was a soft knock, and the nurse from earlier peeked in. "Doctor, about their prescription for Mr. Gable in room 4? Dr. Miller turned to her, his posture relaxing into camaraderie. He gave a slight, weary roll of his eyes, a silent, shared joke at the expense of the demanding clientele. "Classic old man hypochondria," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. "Thinks a stiff shoulder is a prelude to the grave." The nurse offered a tight, complicit smile and left. The air left my lungs. It wasn't the insult itself, though that stung. It was the casual cruelty of it, the absolute certainty of his own superiority. He had reduced me to a caricature, a predictable specimen in the jar labeled aging. He saw the cane, the wrinkles, the slow gait, and he filled in the rest with assumptions. He didn't see the man who had solved complex proofs, who had built a life, a family, a history. He saw a checklist of symptoms and a burden on his time. He turned back to me, completely unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in the room. He finished his notes on the tablet. "Everything looks within expected parameters for a man of your age and history." He finally looked me directly in the eye, and a small, condescending chuckle escaped his lips. "Sir, honestly, at your age, you don't really need to worry about long-term care plans or aggressive interventions. Nature usually takes its course before that becomes a pressing issue." The words hung in the sterile air, cold and absolute. Nature usually takes its course. He was not just dismissing my pain, he was dismissing my future. My remaining time, however long or short that might be, was, in his professional opinion, not worth the investment. A quiet, cold stillness settled over me. The initial flash of hot anger cooled, compressed, and transformed into something entirely different. A focused, crystalline resolve. This wasn't a moment for outrage. Outrage is messy, emotional, and ultimately powerless. This was a moment for a proof.
In mathematics, you don't defeat a flawed theorem with shouting. You defeat it with a superior, irrefutable logic. You demonstrate the error, step by logical step, until the conclusion is inescapable. I looked him dead in his eye, the young, brilliant Dr. Miller, and I smiled. A small, quiet, knowing smile. I said nothing. The smile seemed to unsettle him more than any protest would have. His own smug expression faltered for a microsecond. He cleared his throat. "Well, unless you have any other pressing concerns, we'll see you next year." I nodded, still smiling, and carefully eased myself off the table. I took my time, collecting my cane, my coat. I didn't look at him again. The battle, for now, was over. The war, however, had just been declared. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of my town, the houses where I knew the names of the families, the park where Martha and I used to walk, it all looked the same, but I was different. I was a man with a mission. The humiliation was a raw, burning coal in my chest, but I fanned it, not into a wildfire, but into the steady, focused flame of a forge. I would use this heat to temper my revenge, to shape it into something precise, elegant, and utterly devastating. When I got home, the silence of the house was no longer lonely. It was contemplative. I went straight to my study, a room Martha had always called my sanctum. Bookshelves bowed under the weight of mathematical texts and historical biographies. My old oak desk, scarred with ink and memory, stood sentinel by the window. I sat down. I opened a drawer and took out a fresh, yellow legal pad and my favorite fountain pen, a heavy, reliable instrument I'd received upon my retirement. At the top of the page, in my careful, precise script, I wrote, "Subject: a case study in unprofessional conduct and ethical breach, Dr. Miller, Comprehensive Wellness Center." This would not be a complaint. It would be a dissertation. The following week became a ritual of quiet, determined focus. My daily routines, the careful brewing of my morning tea, the tending to Martha's rose bushes in the back garden, the slow walk to the mailbox, all became the backdrop to the main event unfolding in my study. The encounter with Dr. Miller was no longer a raw wound, it was a data set, and I was the analyst. I began by reconstructing the appointment, minute by minute, word by word. I wrote down every question he had asked, every interruption he had made. I described his body language, the failure to make eye contact, the focus on the tablet, the dismissive wave of his hand. I noted the exact time I had been kept waiting. I documented his muttered comment to the nurse, "Classic old man hypochondria," placing it in its precise context. And then I saved my most potent piece of evidence for last, his final, chilling statement. "Sir, at your age, you don't really need to worry about long-term care. Nature usually takes its course before that." I didn't just write it down. I deconstructed it. On a new page, I began the real work. I went online, a skill I'd been forced to learn to stay connected with my grandchildren, and I researched. I found the American Medical Association's Code of Medical Ethics. I printed out sections on patient autonomy, on dignity, on communication. I highlighted phrases like, "A physician shall be dedicated to providing competent medical care with compassion and respect for human dignity and rights," and "A physician shall uphold the standards of professionalism, be honest in all professional interactions." I then cross-referenced his behavior against these standards. It was like grading a particularly poor student essay. Statement regarding nature taking its course demonstrates a fundamental disregard for the principle of patient hope and violates the duty to avoid non-beneficial interventions, which includes non-beneficial statements. I wasn't angry in my writing. I was dispassionate, clinical. I was the teacher, and Dr. Miller's professionalism was receiving a failing grade. But I knew that for a proof to be unassailable, it needed a level of rigor that transcended the personal. I couldn't just be a disgruntled old man. I had to be a credible witness. So I built my own credibility into the document. I mentioned my career as a mathematics teacher, a profession built on logic, precision, and clear communication. I described my work on the school board, where I had helped draft policies on student-teacher conduct. I was establishing my ethos, my character, not as a victim, but as a reliable observer of facts. The letter grew. It was no longer a letter. It was a dossier. 10 pages, single-spaced, meticulously organized with headings and subheadings, chronology of events, analysis of ethical breaches, specific violations of AMA code, the impact of dismissive language on elderly patient care. I footnoted my sources. It was dry, factual, and utterly damning. My friend, George, a retired lawyer, came over for chess one afternoon. He found me at my desk, surrounded by printed ethics codes. "Working on a new theorem, Arthur?" he asked, setting up the board. "In a manner of speaking," I said, sliding a copy of the finished document toward him. "I'd value your opinion. Think of it as an appellate brief." George put on his reading glasses and spent 20 minutes in silence, his face growing increasingly grave. He finished, took off his glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Hell's bells, Arthur. You haven't just filed a complaint. You've built a guillotine. This is magnificent and terrifying. The hospital board won't know what hit them. They're used to emotional rants. This is a legal and ethical evisceration." "I just want him to understand the error of his ways," I said, moving my pawn to E4. George laughed, a sharp, appreciative bark. "He's going to understand it all the way to the unemployment line. You're not asking for an apology. You're demanding a systemic correction." That was exactly it. I didn't want him punished in a dark room. I wanted his error exposed to the light, demonstrated for all to see. I wanted the QED scrawled underneath my argument for the entire world, or at least the entire hospital administration, to witness. The next day, I mailed the packet, certified and with the return receipt requested, to the chairman of the Hospital Board of Governors, the director of medical ethics, and the head of the Comprehensive Wellness Center. Then I waited. The days turned into weeks. The burning coal of humiliation had cooled into the patient heavy weight of anticipation. I tended my roses. I reread my favorite biographies. I played chess with George, who would ask with a gleam in his eye, "Heard from the executioner yet?" Finally, a month to the day after I'd mailed the packets, the phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of the hospital network. I picked up the receiver. "Arthur Thompson speaking." "Mr. Thompson," a smooth baritone voice said. "This is Robert Hammond, director of the Comprehensive Wellness Center. I'm calling regarding the comprehensive communication you sent to our board." My grip tightened on the phone. I received the delivery confirmation. I trust you found my notes thorough. There was a pause on the other end, a carefully measured silence. Thorough is an understatement, Mr. Thompson. I've been in healthcare administration for 20 years, and I have never seen a document of such precise and compelling criticism. It has been the subject of considerable discussion at the highest levels here. I'm glad to hear it was given due consideration, I said, my voice even. We would be very grateful, Mr. Hammond continued, choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield, if you would be willing to come in for a personal meeting. We feel this is a situation that warrants a face-to-face discussion. Would you be available next Tuesday at 10 a.m.? I looked at my calendar, a bland, empty grid. I made a show of rustling the pages. Tuesday at 10 is acceptable, I said. Excellent. We will see you then. And Mr. Thompson, thank you. Your willingness to engage is appreciated. I hung up the phone. The patient weight of anticipation was gone, replaced by the sharp, clear focus of a mathematician walking into the final exam. The variables were aligning. The proof was nearing its conclusion. The following Tuesday, I dressed with more care than I had in years. I chose my one good suit, a dark gray wool that still hung reasonably well on my frame, a crisp white shirt, and a tie Martha had given me for our 40th anniversary. I polished my shoes. I wanted my appearance to communicate one thing: respect. The respect I deserved, and the respect he had failed to give. George drove me, insisting on being my legal counsel, though he waited in the car with a newspaper. "Give 'em hell, Arthur," he said with a grin as I eased myself out of the passenger seat. The walk to Mr. Hammond's office was familiar. The same path I'd taken to my own humiliation a month prior. But this time the rhythm of my cane on the floor was not an anthem of frailty. It was a drumbeat. Tap, step, drag. Each sound a marker of my advancing purpose. Mr. Hammond's secretary ushered me into a corner office that was all light and authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city, and the desk was a vast expanse of polished dark wood. Mr. Hammond, a man in his late 50s with a trim gray beard and a sober, intelligent face, rose to greet me, his hand extended. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct and respectful. And then my gaze shifted to the other person in the room. Sitting in a low-slung leather chair, looking like he wished it would swallow him whole, was Dr. Miller. He was pale. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead and upper lip. He couldn't meet my eyes. His own darted from the floor to the window, to the books on Hammond's shelf, anywhere but at me. He looked young, not just in age, but in spirit, a chastened schoolboy summoned to the principal's office. The satisfaction that washed over me was not hot and vengeful. It was cold, deep, and profoundly still. This was the first step of the solution. "Please, have a seat," Mr. Hammond said, gesturing to a comfortable chair facing his desk. I sat, leaning my cane against the armrest, and folded my hands in my lap. I said nothing. I simply waited. Mr. Hammond cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet.
Mr. Thompson, first, let me apologize on behalf of the entire center for the egregious failure in care you experienced with Dr. Miller. The document you provided was illuminating. We have taken it very seriously. It has prompted a full review of our patient communication protocols, particularly as they pertain to our senior patients.
I gave a slight, gracious nod. I'm pleased to hear that my observations may have a positive systemic effect. That was my primary hope. Mr. Hammond glanced at the young doctor, his expression hardening. Dr. Miller, I believe you have something you wish to say to Mr. Thompson. Dr. Miller's head jerked up. He looked at Hammond, then his eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and shame, finally flickered toward me. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed, hard. Mr. Thompson, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. I want to apologize for my unprofessional conduct. My comments were inappropriate. They were out of line. The words fell into the room like stones. They were the correct words, but they had no soul. They were a script poorly read. I remained silent, my hands still folded, my gaze steady. I let the emptiness after his apology hang there, let him feel its weight. My silence was a question his weak apology had not answered. Flustered, he stumbled on. I have the utmost respect for our patients, all of them. I don't know what came over me. That was the wrong thing to say. It was an excuse, an attempt to externalize the flaw. Finally, I spoke, my voice quiet but clear, cutting through his panic. I don't believe that's true, Doctor.
He flinched as if I'd struck him. I don't believe you don't know what came over you, I continued. I think you know exactly what it was. It was arrogance. The belief that your knowledge gave you license to dismiss a person's experience. It wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a fundamental error in your methodology. Mr. Hammond was watching me. His eyes narrowed in fascination. He saw that this was not a simple desire for an "I'm sorry." I turned my attention back to him. An apology is a start, Mr. Hammond, but it addresses the symptom, not the disease. The disease is a lack of understanding. Hammond leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, steepling his fingers. What would you suggest, Mr. Thompson, beyond the disciplinary action we are already considering for Dr. Miller? This was the moment, the culmination of my proof. A lesson, I said simply, not just for Dr. Miller, but for any young doctor who might be prone to the same error. You have a staff training session next month, I believe, on patient relations. Hammond's eyes widened slightly in surprise. We do. I would like to speak at it, not as a victim, not as a complainant, but as a case study. As a patient and as a former educator, I believe I can provide a perspective your staff will not get from a textbook or a seminar leader. I can show them the human cost of a dismissive word. I can demonstrate the difference between treating a disease and treating a person.
The room was utterly silent. Dr. Miller looked horrified. The thought of having to sit and listen to me, the old man he'd mocked, lecture him and his colleagues on his failures, was clearly a fate worse than any suspension. A slow smile spread across Robert Hammond's face. It was a smile of grim, brilliant appreciation. He saw the elegant justice of it. It wasn't punitive. It was pedagogical. It was perfect. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of respect, "that is an exceptional proposal. We would be honored to have you." The auditorium was cold, and the lights were bright, reflecting off the expectant faces of 50 young medical professionals. They sat in tiered seating, a sea of white coats and attentive, if slightly bored, expressions. It was the last day of their mandatory patient relations training, and I could sense the fatigue in the room. They were waiting for the lunch break. I stood at the podium, my notes not the damning dossier, but a new, more conversational speech, neatly arranged before me. My cane was leaning against the side of the lectern. In the front row, off to the side, sat Robert Hammond, and directly in the center of the third row, his face a pale, stony mask, was Dr. Miller. He had not looked at me once since I'd been ushered into the room. Hammond introduced me. "Our speaker today is Mr. Arthur Thompson, a retired educator with over 30 years of experience. He is here today to offer a unique and invaluable perspective, that of the patient. I urge you all to listen closely." A polite, perfunctory round of applause rippled through the room. I adjusted the microphone, the sound echoing slightly. I took a slow breath, letting my gaze travel across the audience. I saw the same confidence, the same impatience I had seen in Dr. Miller. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady, amplified through the silence. "For 35 years, I stood in front of rooms not unlike this one. My subject was mathematics, and the single most important lesson I ever tried to impart to my students was that the correct answer is useless if you don't understand the problem." I paused, letting that settle. You are all problem solvers. You are trained to look at a set of symptoms, fever, pain, abnormal test results, and find the correct answer, the diagnosis. It is a noble and brilliant pursuit, but I am here today to tell you that you are often reading the problem wrong. I saw a few eyebrows raise. A young woman in the second row stopped doodling on her notepad. The problem is not the disease. The problem is the person who has the disease, the person who is frightened, the person who is in pain, the person who has lived a long, complex life and who brings the entirety of that life into this examination room with them. When you look at me, what do you see? I gestured to myself, to my suit, my cane. You see an old man. You see a checklist, blood pressure, cholesterol, prostate exam. You see a collection of parts that are wearing out, and you are not entirely wrong. I picked up my cane. You see this, and you think mobility issues, elderly. But this cane is made of black walnut. I carved it myself in the workshop behind my house after my wife, Martha, passed away. I carved it to give my hands something to do besides feel the emptiness of the house. Every groove, every smoothed curve is a memory of her. It is not just a mobility aid. It is a narrative. It is a story of love and loss. And when I walk into your office, that story walks in with me. And if you fail to see that, You have failed to read the most important variable in the equation." The room was preternaturally still now. I had their complete attention.
I spoke about dignity. I spoke about the profound vulnerability of sitting on that crinkly paper in a flimsy gown while someone in a position of power holds your chart and your fate in their hands. I spoke about the language they use, how phrases like "at your age" are not clinical observations. They are dismissals. They are a way of saying your data is no longer relevant to the long-term model. I never mentioned Dr. Miller by name. I didn't have to. I simply recounted the story of my checkup. I described the feeling of being talked over. I repeated verbatim the muttered comment about old man hypochondria. I let his words, my words, hang in the air, allowing their sheer, unvarnished cruelty to resonate in the silent, attentive room. I saw faces flinch. I saw looks of dawning horror. They were connecting the dots. They knew this wasn't a hypothetical. This was a post-mortem of a real, living failure, and the patient was standing right in front of them, calmly dissecting it for their education. "The most dangerous assumption a scientist can make," I said, my voice lowering, "is to believe the data set is complete. When you look at an elderly patient and assume you know their story, their pain, their capacity for understanding, you have closed the book before reading the final chapters. You have rendered your own knowledge incomplete. And incomplete knowledge, in medicine as in mathematics, leads to flawed solutions. It leads to misdiagnosis. It leads to suffering." I looked up from my notes and let my gaze travel, slowly, deliberately, across the third row. I found him, Dr. Miller. His head was bowed, his shoulders hunched. He was staring at his own hands clenched tightly in his lap. He was utterly exposed, naked in his shame in front of his mentors and his peers. The person in front of you is not a statistic. They are a human being with a history, with fears, with dignity. They are you, or your father, or your grandmother. And someday, sooner than you think, that person in the paper gown, being talked down to, being dismissed, will be you. Treat them with the respect you will one day hope to receive.
I stopped. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. It was a physical presence, heavy and profound. Then Robert Hammond, in the front row, began to clap. It was not a polite applause. It was a strong, solid, deliberate ovation. One by one, then in a wave, the entire room joined him. The sound was thunderous, filling the space, a genuine, heartfelt acknowledgement of the lesson they had just been taught. I gathered my notes. I picked up my cane. I didn't look at Dr. Miller again. I didn't need to. The proof was complete. The theorem of his arrogance had been definitively disproven. Quod erat demonstrandum. As I made my way slowly out of the auditorium, a few of the young doctors approached me, offering quiet thanks, shaking my hand. Their eyes were earnest, their respect genuine. I had not destroyed a man. I had, I hoped, helped to build better ones. My last checkup was 3 months ago. A different, older, and infinitely more respectful doctor saw me. The staff knew my name. They offered me coffee. They treated me with a deference that was both gratifying and, in a quiet way, a testament to the lesson that had been learned. And Dr. Miller? I saw him once, from a distance, in the hospital cafeteria. He was sitting alone. He didn't see me. He didn't laugh. Some lessons, the hard ones, the ones that strike at the core of who you are, have a way of silencing you. I had taught him that, not with a shout, but with a quiet, irrefutable logic. I had reminded him that while bodies may fail, wisdom doesn't retire. And sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is simply to be heard.